Hey there! In this month's edition of BBC History UK dated June 2021, there was an article that looked at 5 eccentric hermits throughout the years. For a start, we looked at a monk, Simeon, who was known for spending time up on top of a pillar. Following that, there was a story about hermits for hire in the early 17th century. In the Victorian era, a reverend can be found in Wales living in squalor. The Pailton miser, Joseph Underhill, was known for living in a pigsty.Last, but not least, the infamous Howard Hughes got a worthy mention too. If you are looking for more information on how these 5 hermits lived till the end, continue listening on as we go through the article. 5 eccentric hermit. Living the high life. Just what does it take to make a hermit? According to the Cambridge Dictionary, it's a person who lives alone and apart from the rest of society, especially for religious reasons. But in reality, these characters can be far more complex. For more than 1,500 years, holy, eccentric, or billionaire recluses have been figures of fascination but also of paradox. One example is a monk named Simeon. While he lived in the monastery of Telida, Syria, in c. 411 AD, he sparked many complaints. Simeon smelled so bad that no one could bear to stand near him. Further investigation revealed that he had bound a rope around himself beneath his tunic, yanking it so tightly that his flesh has rotted and his bed was full of worms. At this stage, however, Simeon's Stylites had barely begun on his unusual career. By the time that he died in AD 459, he claimed to have spent 47 years living on top of a pillar. Even allowing for some boasting, he seems to have spent at least 28 years up there. To be precise, there had been various pillars, of increasingly great height, the last being 60 feet tall. Measuring 3.5 feet in diameter, his final pillar supported a good-sized platform of around 43 square feet at its summit, and it initially had a canopy of palm branches to keep off sun and rain. Isabel Colgate, who details all this in her wonderful book on hermits, A Pelican in the Wilderness, adds that Simeon also had use of a lavatory, with an earthenware pipe running down to the ground. If to many of us, hermit means solitude, Simeon appears paradoxical. He might nowadays be dismissed as a pathological attention seeker. His excesses of asceticism and self-loathing drew crowds from all over Europe and the Middle East to marvel at him. Simeon tirelessly shouted sermons at watching crowds, and one observer saw him make 1,244 genuflections, bending one knee as a sign of respect, before they lost count. In our times, Simeon would doubtless have signed a lucrative contract for a special edition of "I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Down From Here" Hermits for hire. In the 1740s, Charles Hamilton, son of the 6th Earl of Abercorn, began creating a landscape garden at Painchill, near Cobham in Surrey. Along with a grotto and a Roman ruin, Painchill had a rustic 2-room hermitage, composed of logs and roots. All that was needed now was a live-in hermit. What could better satisfy the 18th century vogue for picturesque history? And so Hamilton advertised for applicants, stressing that the hermit must continue in the hermit age for 7 years, where he would be provided with a Bible, optical glasses, a mat for his feet, a hassock for his pillow, an hour glass for his timepiece, water for his beverage, and food from the house. The hermit would have to wear a camlet robe, never cut his beard or nails, stray beyond the limits of Mr. Hamilton's grounds, or exchange one word with the servant. Isabel Colgate explains that he would be paid 700 guineas if he lasted for 7 years, but he would receive nothing if he broke the rules or left early. In fact, the hermit who was hired only lasted 3 weeks before he was spotted creeping out of the grounds to go down to the local pub. Another version of the story puts the reward at £3,000. And the place was hardly gloomy. The gardening expert Thomas Whately stated in 1770 that, from the front room, the hermit could look out over the gardens and the country around the river Mole, which is rich with every appearance of inhabitants and cultivation. Perhaps our paid hermit was driven to drink by the inauthenticity of the whole setup. If so, he might have been much happier. When the estate fell into ruins after 1948 until a program of restoration began in the 1980s. Love and squalor. Come the Victorian era, a holy hermit could still be found at Llanbdr, Wales. Here is in July 1872. The curate, Francis Kilvert, paid him a visit, leaving the bright sunshine for the interior of a hut where he found the squalor, the dirt, the dust, the foulness and wretchedness, indescribable, almost inconceivable. And in this cabin thus lives the solitary of Llanbdr, the Reverend John Price, Master of Arts of Cambridge. At the same time, walking out with Price a little later, Kilvert was struck by the way the people touched their hats to his reverence with great respect. They recognized him as a very holy man, and if the solitary had lived 1,000 years ago he would have been revered as a hermit and perhaps canonized as a saint. Price was amazingly unworldly and selfless. According to the writer, Jeremy Bovell, to get any sort of congregation, Price had to resort to paying his listeners between 2 and 6 pence a head to come to services, and almost certainly out of his own pocket. Price even offered, claims Bovell, to marry pairs of vagrants who were attached or living in sin on the road as couples, paying them 5 shillings as an incentive. With poor eyesight and a failing grip on reality, apparently, he married several couples a few times each. And Bovell contends, Price was so generous that he even provided oil-fired heater in the colder winter months in the church and permitted tramps and hobos to cook their dinners during his services. More or less abandoned by the church establishment, Price lived on in varying degrees of squalor until his death in 1895, aged 86. When he was finally taken to Talgarth Hospital, his clothes had to be scissored off his body and he was bathed, which resulted in his death. Such was the trauma. A dandy in a pigsty. Secular hermits could be even more unusual. At Pailton near Rugby, a man called Joseph Underhill lived in a pigsty. It was around 5 foot square, and he had to crawl into it on his hands and knees. Readers may be relieved to hear that he was not sharing it with pigs. This, after all, would have been a glaring case of subletting. Underhill paid a Mrs. Robbins 6 a week for his cramped accommodation. Underhill, supposedly a great dandy until he was disappointed in love years before, was not poor. In February 1890, 2 boys were charged with stealing $26 from him, and the newspaper account of the theft stated that he gave nearly $200 to be banked. Local authorities had tried and failed to move Underhill from the pigsty. After the theft, he was placed in a charitable home for some time, but he was soon back on his hands and knees, squeezing himself through the low gap into the muck. Underhill was finally removed, stretchered off on a door, the following January, in a dying state. Even now in terminal weakness, he attempted to escape and get back in. Those clearing out the sty found the floor covered with filth fully half a foot deep. When Underhill died, apparently of exposure and bronchitis, he left behind him £125. The Reclusive Aviator. Aged just 7, I saw Howard Hughes stretchered across an airfield on the evening news. The sight was so horrific that it has stayed with me all my life. When he died in April 1976, officially from kidney failure, Hughes stood 6 feet 2 inches and weighed just 90 pounds. He had once been the great Renaissance man of America, a daredevil aviator, a visionary filmmaker and a figure of impossible glamour. When millionaires were still mythical, Hughes was a billionaire. By 1950, Hughes was already so obsessive about germs that the unused windows of his cars and houses were sealed with masking tape. As authors Donald Bartlett and James Steele explain, aides, drivers and message clerks all had to wear white cotton gloves to the type used in film editing. According to the pair, to open a can of food for Hughes, you needed one unopened newspaper, one sterile can opener, one large sterile plate, one sterile fork, one sterile spoon, 2 sterile brushes, 2 bars of soap and sterile paper towels. Come spring 1957, Hughes was living at the Beverly Hills Hotel in Bungalow 4. He refused to allow janitors to clean and banned his projectionists and guards from the bathroom, suggesting they use milk cartons to relieve themselves. Wearing the same brown shirt and slacks for weeks, he suddenly discarded his clothes and went about naked. Refusing to touch doorknobs, he would kick the door as a signal for an aide to open it. For long periods, Hughes with unwashed and straggling hair and beard and finger and toenails so long that they curled in on themselves, must have looked indistinguishable from any American tramp. Beyond all ordinary help, Hughes was the supreme victim of affluence. He had no friends. When the Las Vegas Desert Inn Hotel tried to throw him and his entourage out in 1966 to accommodate wealthy New Year guest, Hughes bought the place. Like King Lear, Hughes may have been a victim of his own delusions of power. But Lear, at least, had a late epiphany with his daughter, Cordelia. Was he any happier than Underhill, in his rented pigsty? Dollar for dollar, Howard Hughes was perhaps the most expensively miserable man of the 20th century.